All right, last time we left off with just the Trail of Tears in the late 1820s, early 1830s. And Miss McLuhan focused on this movement or forced movement of people from the southeastern United States to basically the dead center in Oklahoma. Um, by the end of the 19th century, as in the end of the 1800s, there's going to be a switch in policy in the United States from trying to move indigenous people around and put them into different spaces far away from the rest of the population of the United States to continue doing uh, their traditional way of life, to actively trying to change that way of life. So the reason this happens is actually tied to some things that we've studied before in this class. So the passage of the Homestead Act during the Civil War encourages people to leave the eastern portions of the United States and move west, like being incentivized, given large plots of land for not spending very much money, to try to encourage people to settle further west. As they do that, more and more people start farming in this space. And because they're farming, there's going to be a push to build a railroad. This railroad is being built from two directions at the same time, one of them starting in California, the other starting in Missouri. They build towards each other. They meet in what's now northern Utah, Promontory Point, super iconic photo. We've seen these like images multiple times in this class. And I think this unit in general is kind of like a culminating unit in that it wraps up a lot of things that we've studied before into like the story of one or like a bunch of different groups of people at the same time. So as this railroad is completed, it's going to mark a transition to the United States becoming more industrial and more interconnected. And it's not very long before the idea of having a frontier or a place that's far away doesn't really exist anymore. So as that happens, there's going to be a renewed issue of like, how do we deal with an indigenous population that's still very different and that's been relocated multiple times before? So in order to change that, the United States tries to change the cultures of these indigenous populations that have already been moved into reservations by breaking up those individual reservations. So I'll use like the example of the, say the Cherokee, because that's like Miss McLuhan talked about yesterday. So if the Cherokee have been moved from their traditional land in northeast Georgia and moved to Oklahoma in 1829, the Cherokee that have been there up until 1887 are now going to be told that this tribal land that you have and you own as a collective group of people is no longer your collective. If you can prove that you're a Cherokee, we will give you an individual plot of this land. And if you can't prove that you're a Cherokee, the plot of land that you're on will be up for sale to any settler at like a reasonable price from the federal government. So what happens is all of these groups of people are forced to take on the role of citizens of the United States, or they gain citizenship. But what they're doing in that form is they're trading their culture to keep their communal land. And if they don't take this option, they lose their culture and then still have the opportunity to basically lose their land at the same time. So they're really stuck in there's like no way to win in this circumstance, but they're forced by the federal government to say that like none of these treaties that we had from before address this issue, and so we're fixing it all right now. Oh yeah, I wanted to pause for this. So most indigenous cultures in the United States lived on land that they viewed as not something that was owned by like individual families or even small groups, but instead that like the collective group of the people owned the land, and that like not even really owned, that it was just like it was something that they all had and shared as a group. And so trying to shift that was the effort of the United States to take away that perception that land could be shared or it was like collectively owned by the whole group of people, and instead was owned by individuals who maybe were part of a community. So I could think of something that like we think of as like a collective in like our society. It would be something like the air. Like you don't own the air around you, but like you do own your shirt. Like there's like the community of like say San Luis Obispo doesn't own like your shirt, but the community owns the air around you. An indigenous population or a native population in the United States, most of these cultures had a stronger sense of communal ownership and collective ownership of that rather than just like individual people who owned it. So big impacts from this shift. If I can move my window, I don't need to move it. Yes, I do. The treaties that have been set up, especially ones from like the early part of the 19th century, were pretty much like torn up and ignored. There's going to be a shift in how people think of an indigenous population existing in the United States by the time this Dawes Act or this like relocation effort has like made its change. People don't think of indigenous populations as really even existing anymore. It's something that's like from the past. This is going to be a move more towards like thinking of like the Old West as like a time from before, and people thinking like the Indian is gone, the Native American population is gone. Like, yeah, there's a handful out there that are still holding on to some cultural ways, but as a people, they no longer exist. And they no longer exist because their capacity to exercise their culture in a full form is not possible anymore. Mostly because millions of acres that they had collectively owned as like a large group has disappeared. It's either been cut up and sold to white settlers who've moved into the space, or it's been cut up and sold to or given to individual populations within this Native American group that would want to try to like hang on to that amount of culture that they had. And I think I got one. Nope, that's it. I'm done. And yeah, let us know if you have questions.